question, what is sin? What would you say? Michaela, you have an answer.
Anything we think, say, or do that breaks God's command.
Okay.
Like the kids club kids like to say, for example.
Okay. Anything that we think, say, or do that breaks God's command, or as again the Kids Club edition, or His heart. And now that one is, we could have some pretty significant discussions about that. We would be discussing the what's called the impassibility of God and other matters like that. But we won't get into any deep theological, philosophical discussions at this point. But anything we think, say, or do that breaks God's commands, that Kids Club definition is actually, it's a pretty good one. And as we look at it, it reflects the larger, more general idea of the breaking of the good. And when you think about what sin is the breaking of the good, and when on a moral level, it's the breaking of the good. And we Christians would say that God is, in His very essence, that God is the definition of, the personification of, and the source of all good. And that's a useful thing for us to think about as we consider who God is. He is the definition of, He is the personification of, and He is ultimately the source of all good. So this is something that, as we take and consider what the implications of that are, the created realm, all of material existence, all of material creation, the whole of the cosmos, in its origin, comes from one who is good, in the fullest sense of the word. And that's a really interesting thing to think about. The physical order comes from one who is good. And that in and of itself starts us at an interesting place when we think about creation having come from, having its origin in, being sourced in one who is good. Because what it does is it starts out by giving us an upbeat view to our understanding of existence. Now, that's a really interesting thing. The fact that when you take a look at it, if you're a Christian, and have a Christian worldview, your worldview is foundationally a hopeful worldview. That's an interesting thing to think about. We exist, and we know that this world isn't as it should be. We know that creation as a whole goes through all sorts of things that we don't understand. But the created order is itself coming from one who is, in essence, good. And so we have a hopeful worldview. Now, this is a different thing than, for instance, you would face if you were to stop and think about things from a Buddhist perspective. Because all physical material existence, if you come at things from a Buddhist experience or a Buddhist view of things, is suffering. And because everything is suffering, ultimately what you were looking for, your aim is non-existence. Your aim is actually to get rid of the illusion of personhood, to get rid of the illusion and the illusion and experience of suffering that comes in this life. That's where you're aimed toward. And so we believe that the created realm comes from one who is good. Now think about this from the perspective of the Genesis assessment. What's God's assessment at the end of each day of His creating work? What does He say? Pardon? Yeah, He looks at it all and He says, it is good. And then what happens on day 6 as He completes and as He finally brings into existence humanity, what does He say at that point? It was very good, yeah. And so we have this Genesis assessment, and think to yourself about Jesus, and think about Jesus' response to the Pharisee who comes to him, and the Pharisee who says to him, "Good teacher." And what does Jesus say in response to that one who says, "Good teacher"? Right. Why do you call me good? There is no one who is good except God. And so what he's doing there is, Jesus isn't saying that there's nothing good that ever happens or anything like that, but what he's doing is ultimately he is taking he's doing a couple things. One of the things that he's doing is actually he's forcing the guy to confront what he might actually be saying about Jesus himself by calling him good. He's saying, hey, guess what? By saying this, you're putting me in the realm of divinity. You're putting me alongside of God. But the other thing which Jesus would have claimed for himself, but he's making somewhat explicit in that statement. But the other reality is that he is saying that the source and the fountain of all goodness is God himself. And so we look at this and we think to ourselves, okay, we come with this recognition of creation having come from one who is good and who is in his entirety good. But there's a problem. We know there's a problem. And this problem is the fact that there's the crazy reality that humans can be extremely others destructive and self-destructive. And so we have this world that has come from one who is the source of all goodness, who created it all good, but now, because of a combination of desiring what we shouldn't and disregarding what we shouldn't and straight on perverse delight in malevolence and causing others pain, things don't look good. In fact, I would imagine that if I were to ask you to talk to me about the last 2 weeks of news, there would be a lot of you who would be looking, and by the time we got to the end of the conversation, just about the last 2 weeks alone, we'd be going, oh. Because there is so much that we see that through, as I said, the combination of desiring what we shouldn't or disregarding things we shouldn't disregard, or the straight-on perverse desire to do things that are malevolent and cause others pain. Things are not good. We have a sin problem. There's the desire and fight for the resources of others that's gone on it's gone on since the beginning of humanity. Through history, people have fought for the stuff of others in ways that has cost millions of lives and caused untold misery. I mean, if you stop and think about it, I've mentioned before that over the last 2,000 plus years, there's only been 150 years in the last 2,000 where there has not been a major war going on. Not just a regional conflict, but a major war going on, according to the parts of the earth for which we have historical record. And if during that 150 years of history where there has been something akin to widespread peace, if we were to actually be able to take a look at what was going on in the Americas during that time, which we wouldn't have had any historical record for, or in Australia or wherever it might have been, we'd probably find that there were wars that we don't have in our Western historical record. The reality is that humans have been inclined to do bad things to humans for a long, long time. And long before we get to things even as major as wars, we know that there are many personal ways that we do harm to and wrong others and show unkindness and inconsideration simply in households, in families, in communities. Sin is a big issue. And this is an important thing for us to be clear on. Societies need rules and laws and the threats of consequence to prevent their descent into savagery. How many of you know what anarchy is? How many of you know what the positive language about anarchy is? About speaking, has anybody ever heard anybody talk positively about anarchy? Yes, they do speak positively. What kind of things do people say when it comes to anarchy? Well, first of all, what does anarchy mean? Well, that's what the popular thinking, the popular wording has become in our minds. Does anybody know technically what anarchy means? Anarchy, yeah. Okay, anarchy means no rulers. Okay, no kings. Okay, let's have no rulers. Okay, arche is Greek to deal with the whole idea of rule, and an is against or not, means against or not. So there are plenty of people who speak in positive terms about technical anarchy. What kind of things do they say? Imagine no. Pardon? What's that?
I'm my own boss, nobody's over top of me.
Yeah, if nobody's over top of me, everything's going to be wonderful. You listen to what John Lennon is saying when he's saying imagine. And what he has to say there ultimately is really kind of dumb. But it's popular. The thing is, we make these assumptions. At least there are some who make the assumptions that if what happens was we removed rules and rulers, we would all just get along. How many of you as parents have experienced that in your home? You remove all the rules and remove any sense of authority, and your kids, everything just turns wonderful. Yeah. It's kind of interesting that it doesn't work that way. And in 1 Timothy, I always I like these verses because of the fact that I think that as Paul writes this to Timothy, what he does is he simply gives us some clarity as far as the human condition is concerned and human need. He says in 1 Timothy chapter 1, beginning at verse 8, now we know. Now this is interesting. So understand as Paul talks here, Paul is talking to believers to whom he is teaching grace and the grace of God. And as he's teaching grace and the grace of God, one of the things that he does do is he moves against the concept of legalism, of the fact that if we just have enough laws, it's going to make everything wonderful. Okay? Because that's not where Paul comes to. But what he does do is he wants to make sure that in the course of his teaching, people don't look and say that what he's saying is that we should have anomia, no laws, or anarchy, or anything like that. So as he explains it, he says in verse 8, just talking about the human condition and life here in this world, he says, we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully. Well, that's an interesting discussion in and of itself. What's the possibility when it comes to law? He gives this careful rider on it. He says, if one uses it lawfully. Why do you think that Paul would have to say that? Pardon? The law was? The law is constantly abused. There's no question. It's the law is constantly used by people, twisted by people, and made a means to club or to take advantage of people. But he says we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient. Now that's an interesting statement, isn't it? The law is not there for the just, it's there for the lawless and the disobedient. What do you think he's saying in that? Pardon? Okay, so why is he saying that? Why does he say the law is not there for the just, it's there for the lawless and disobedient? Yes. Okay, exactly. It's there to give consequences as a motivation when people for a motivation for not doing wrong. Really, what he's saying then is he's helping us understand that the law doesn't make moral goodness, it only prevents moral evil. So he says, we need this boundary. We need this boundary on the human condition to prevent moral evil. The law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine, in accordance with the gospel of the glory of the blessed God with which I have been entrusted. Oh, by the way, just quick aside for those of you who have ever heard the Bible doesn't say anything against slavery statement before, that the Bible's pro-slavery. This is an interesting verse, I always think. The sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, and slavers, those who take slaves. Guess what? Guess what? The Bible presents them as lawless, as being the people who are not just in their character, and so needing to be restrained by law to keep them from doing evil. But anyways, all of this to say we don't do well as a population under self-rule. We don't do well if we try to operate as anarchists in the technical political sense of the word. Those who look and say, everything will turn out if we don't have any laws and any rulers. And we can drop into behaviors that are self-destructive personally and damaging to our own well-being and character and relationships, even though we see potential consequences and try to rationalize that it won't happen to us. How many of you have ever sinned knowing that you were sinning? Okay. See, I only ever sinned by mistake. Okay. You're laughing because you know, you've observed me. You know that's not true of me. The thing is, we have this reality. We can know the consequences or the potential consequences. We can see the damage that would come from an action, and yet we will try to rationalize that it won't happen to us, or we will decide that there's something we want more. And the crazy thing is, sometimes when I think about some of the things that we want more, like you think about the fact of, and hopefully you've matured to some degree that this isn't so much the case for you, but sometimes it's a matter of taking and saying, okay, well, I know that this is just going to cause a fight, that I'm going to be sticking a barb in, that I'm going to be causing some pain, but boy, my delight in that person's pain is greater than the restraint on my mouth right now. You think about that, and you consider the reality that this is who we can be. Experience shows then that sin is an enormously problematic reality of the human condition. And we Christians, from our worldview, we would see it as an everyday reality that we have to fight against. We would see it as something that's an internal principle that we need to fight, because it actually isn't simply out there, it actually has root in us, and it has root in everyone around us. We see it as something that we must deal with and battle against. Turn to Hebrews chapter 12. Someone read for me Hebrews 12, verses 3 through 6, and we'll also look at Romans 7, 17 through 20, and we're not going to go through these in detail, but just as referential statements that are made in Scripture that are useful for us to think about in this. Hebrews chapter 12. Someone read that for me, please, verses 3 through 6. Sorry, verse 3. Begin at verse 3, please, Daryl. Thank you. Yeah, 3 to 6. Yeah.
Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood, and have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives.
Now, this is interesting because he's talking in the context of the fact of suffering that they're experiencing from external forces, but then he brings it to the fact of simply there being stuff internally that has to be dealt with and chastened. And so he says, and you haven't resisted against sin, or you haven't fought against sin to the shedding of your own blood. And so there's this statement that's made about the fact that this is something that isn't simply what they're experiencing in faith out there from people who are bad, but it's something that actually they have to deal with as children of God. Romans chapter 7. Go ahead and read for me Romans 7, verses 17 through 20, please.
So now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is, in my flesh. For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me.
Okay, so we could go in and work through this and try and work through it in a very, very detailed way. But the thing that I want us to understand overall out of this is that as Paul talks about it, he talks about the fact that internally we have this struggle, this problem that we fight against. And yes, we are followers of Christ. Yes, we have trusted Christ and the Spirit of God is within us. But yes, there is still the fact that we fight against the sin principle that is internal to us. Now this is a significant thing to think about in our worldview, that we look at it and we see sin as a problem, and we see sin not simply as, well, Zeth has a problem with sin and I'm okay. We look at it as something that collectively we internally have to deal with. So I can't look at another tribe or another group of people and say, well, obviously it's all their fault. And obviously I'm good. I have to look at it from the perspective of the fact that there is something that flows through all of humanity, that every one of us, beginning with me, beginning in my perspective and my look with me, every one of us has to deal with and wrestle with. Now, two of the dominant worldviews that float around our country share the same limited ability to address sin well or consistently or thoughtfully or logically for the same reasons. Both secular atheism and Buddhism, which is an actual, it's a philosophical atheism, both secular atheism and Buddhism as atheist worldviews really can't give good answers when it comes to the sin question. By the way, when I put those two together, secular atheism and Buddhism, they come from different perspectives, but they have no problem with, because of the fact that they're both atheisms, they both do end up, we think of Buddhism as a religion, but it's really more of a philosophy. And it's an atheistic philosophy, and they overlap very well. And that's why, for instance, how many of you know the name Sam Harris? Okay, so different ones of you know the name Sam Harris. Sam Harris is a materialist atheist. He's considered to be one of the more prominent voices for atheism in the culture. He was called at one point one of the four horsemen of the new atheism. But anyways, Harris is both an atheist and a practicing Buddhist. And the reason that he can be an atheist and a Buddhist is because Buddhism is essentially atheistic. So with this, what ends up happening is that he's an atheist who still feels, in some sense, the ache for something mystical. And because he feels the ache for something mystical, which is an interesting thing in and of itself to consider of the human condition, that we need the mystical, we need the numinous. Why is that? Why is there this hunger for us to be connected to something bigger? Exactly. We're coming back to the reality of image of God as we talked about it a couple weeks back. But here he is. What happens is he's a secular materialist atheist, and yet at the same time he is a Buddhist because of the fact that he needs that which fulfills his desire for the mystical and something larger than himself. But the inabilities of these two worldviews are the same when it comes to the issue of sin. Both actually don't have a basis for good. Both don't have a basis for personhood. So why does doing good to another person ultimately even matter? And that's why if you take a look and think of how Buddhism operates, essentially it ultimately has this sense of detachment. Now, what they have done is they've developed an ethical system in the whole idea of the alleviation of suffering. But it's not necessary. Because if you're not persons, suffering is just an illusion anyways. And so both don't have a basis for good or personhood or an actual belief that there is such a thing, such a principle as sin. In fact, Buddhists would ultimately, if you take and you pin it down, they would say that sin is an illusion. Okay, just like suffering is an illusion. Just like personhood is an illusion. And that's why coming to the highest state in Buddhism is actually no state at all. The highest state of Buddhism is actually non-existence. And that's not a whole lot different than materialistic atheism, is it? Life is suffering, then you die. So we start with the fact that a materialist atheism has no universal law of good. It just has competing interests and opinions. So at best, good is developed by majority vote. And you have to take a look at that, and you have to think, okay, so if good is just developed by majority vote, why is that binding? Why would that have actually any moral call on my life if I decided to go against the majority? And what if we really detest the minority? What if the minority are like Jews? And I'm saying that not because I am a detester of Jews, but I'm saying that to point you to the historical reality of what happens when you don't have a moral, an underlying moral foundation. If the majority of your population says, let's have Kristallnacht, then you can have Kristallnacht. There is no moral basis ultimately to determine that something is a sin. There's only a majority agreement as to how we're going to operate. And Buddhism, interestingly, has a universal law, but they have no reason for it. It's just there. So in a lot of ways, when you take a look at Buddhism's universal law is essentially the closest thing that they get to the uncaused cause. It's where they come to when you think of your little yin and yang picture. That's the uncaused cause. So it's an interesting thing to consider. Now the question is, why is it there? Why is there a universal law? Anyways, we're going to stop because of time right now, but we for us, I will say this, just kind of jump ahead, and I'm not going to draw the whole picture in this moment, but for us, ultimately, I think that probably both on the level of hope, that there is hope, but then also on the level of the fact that acting like all of existence is an illusion really seems pointless and empty. Thinking of all of existence as an illusion doesn't sit well with reality. And if it's an illusion, then nothing of what we do matters anyways. So even the alleviation of suffering really isn't necessary because it's all an illusion. Christians believe all the way down that things matter because they're real. So that is something that distinguishes us from both the Buddhist and from the atheist, because the atheist would say, well, these are all constructed realities. The Buddhist would say these are all illusion realities. In either case, they're not real. No person here is real. No moral law is real. The idea of breaking moral laws is unreal. These things are all illusions. Okay, I'm going to stop at that. Any questions? Okay, let's take a moment and pray. Father, thank you for your goodness to us. We thank you for life that we have through your Son. And Lord, we thank you for the fact that we have hope, and the fact that we're able to take a look and see this existence as being real and meaningful. We understand that it's not the whole story and it's not the final word, but we do thank you that we live lives that matter. We thank you for the fact that we have a hope that's real and that we have the promise of life with you forever. I pray this in Jesus' name.